I'm Bob Short, and this is another in a series of oral histories in Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest is Jack Watson, former state official and chief of staff for President Jimmy Carter. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you.
We're most anxious to talk to you today about your political and professional careers. First, as a cornerstone in Governor Jimmy Carter's reorganization of Georgia's state government, and then as a key member of his presidential staff. But before we do, tell us a little about Jack Watson.
I was born in El Paso, Texas. I lived in Texas until I was 10 years old, and then my family moved to Pine Bluff, Arkansas, which is a little town in southeast Arkansas, about an hour or so southeast of Little Rock, the capital. I went through high school in Pine Bluff and was lucky enough to be awarded a Naval ROTC scholarship to college. And I went to Vanderbilt University on that scholarship. That scholarship meant that all of my books and tuition and a stipend would be paid during my college career. It also meant that during my summers between school years, I would go on some kind of a cruise, first a naval cruise, and then ultimately when I chose the Marine Corps as my service to enter, I went into Marine training, boot camp in effect, test and training regiment in Quantico, Virginia, between my junior and senior years. Upon graduation from Vanderbilt in 1960, I went into the Marine Corps, was commissioned as a regular officer in the United States Marine Corps, went to basic school in Quantico, Virginia for 6 months, and then to the West Coast to Camp Pendleton, where in due time I became a member of a unit called the First Force Reconnaissance Unit in the Marine Corps. Those units are now called Special Operations. They're part of the Special Operations Command. And I was in that unit for the balance of my Marine Corps career. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I went to Harvard Law School. When I got out of Harvard Law School, I came to Atlanta and began practicing with a law firm called King and Spalding, and that's where I met Charles Curbo, who was to be a very important man in my life.
I was going to tell you that as I have known and observed you over the years, I've always felt that there were two Georgians who were in the forefront of your career. One was Curbo, and the other, of course, was Jimmy Carter. You met Curbo in your law practice. He became the mentor of Jimmy Carter, and in fact he was at one time chairman of the Georgia Democratic Party. Tell us about Curbo.
I met Charlie. When I first met him, it was Mr. Curbo. Very much Mr. Curbo. I met Charlie when I was a clerk. After my second year of law school, I had a clerkship at the law firm. That would have been in the summer of 1965. And that's when I met Charlie and spent the summer with the law firm. I actually took the bar that summer before I went back for my third year in law school and was admitted to the bar in 1965. And then went back for my third year in law school. And when I graduated from law school, I returned to the firm as an associate. It's amazing to me, Bob, that when I joined King & Spalding, it was an old and very established law firm, to be sure, in the city. One of the most respected law firms in this part of the country, really. But I was the 28th lawyer at the time. King & Spalding now has offices all over the world and probably has somewhere between 800 and 1,000 lawyers, which is just an amazing thing to me. But I was lawyer number 28, and in those days, those long ago days, every lawyer in the firm, including the lowest associate, who would have been me, had their name on the letterhead of the law firm. I met Charlie and began practicing with him in the summer and fall of 1966. Our offices, as it turned out, once we sort of moved from one building to another, our offices were right down the hall from each other. And Jimmy Carter had run for governor in 1966, as you well know. Mm-hmm. I know you were part of that campaign. Mm-hmm. And I had just joined the law firm that summer. I joined the law firm effective, I think, June 1st of 1966 while Jimmy was running for governor. I didn't know him. I was registered to vote, of course, in Georgia for the first time that summer, and I voted in that November election, but I had never met Mr. Carter. And after Jimmy lost that race, failed to get into the primary just by less than 2 percentage points, Charlie, in the fall of 1966, stopped me in the hallway one day and said, "Jack, have you ever met Jimmy Carter?" And I said, "No, sir, I have not. I'd like to very much. I've read about him, know about him, admire him from a distance, but I do not know him." He said, he reached into his pocket, and as was Charlie's wont, he had a pencil stub, and a scrap of paper, and he pulled out this scrap of paper and he wrote down Jimmy's telephone number on this scrap of paper and handed it to me, and he said, "Call Jimmy." And I put the piece of paper in my pocket and went about my business. A couple of weeks later, I was very busy. I was just scrambling as hard as I could scramble to learn how to practice law and do what I was supposed to be doing. And so it was not that I didn't intend to call Jimmy, but I just didn't get around to it. A couple of weeks later, Charlie saw me in the elevator and said, "Jack, have you called Jimmy yet?" And I said, "No, sir, Mr. Kerber, but I've been so busy and I want to call him and I've got his number." Well, another few days passed and I still hadn't called him, and Mr. Kerber and I happened to be in the men's room at the same time. And I saw him over my shoulder as he came into the room, and I thought, oh my goodness, he's going to ask me if I've called Jimmy Carter, and I've got to say no for the third time. I was so embarrassed. And sure enough, I was trying to get out of there before he asked me, but he said, "Jimmy," he said, "Jack, have you called Jimmy yet?" And I said, "No, sir, Mr. Kerber, but I'm going back to my office at this very moment, and I'm going to call him," which I did. I called, the phone rang, and a male voice answered the phone. And I said, "May I speak to Mr. Carter?" And the voice said, "This is Jimmy." And I started to say who I was and to introduce myself. All I got out was, "Mr. Carter, my name is Jack Watson," and he said, "Jack, what took you so long to call?" So Charlie had obviously spoken to him about it. Not terribly long after that, I arranged with Jimmy to go down and meet him in Plains on a Saturday. And I did, and we spent the whole day together. And that really began. We had breakfast together. We drove around in his car. I think he had a Chevrolet. He took me to see some of the peanut fields and the warehouse, and took me to his house, and out to Archery, Georgia, which is where he was born and grew up until he was about 12 or 13, and had lunch together. And he invited. I met his wife, Rosalind, and Miss Lillian, as I recall, was in the Peace Corps at that time, but I'm not sure about that. I know that I didn't meet her at that time, although she and I later became great friends.
What was your impression of the man who would soon become governor of Georgia and president of the United States?
Well, I never dreamed in my wildest imaginations that I was meeting and talking with and spending the day with a man who was going to be president. But I was mightily impressed by him. I had been an English major in college, in the university at Vanderbilt, and then of course had gone on to law school. And I've always loved to read and been a rather avid reader, and I could almost not bring up anything that he didn't know something about or hadn't read himself. And just in the course of the day, at one point I remember he quoted the German theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and quoted Dr. Niebuhr as saying something about the responsibility of politics, a man in politics, a person in politics. And I thought to myself, this is a very unusual and extraordinary man here in Plains, Georgia, running this peanut warehouse. And I was immediately taken with him. I really knew from that day, from that moment on, that he was a man I wanted to know better and wanted to be on his team if there was going to be a team. In the course of the next 4 years, as you know, Bob, he basically ran for governor for 4 years quietly. I think he gave something like 1,500 speeches between 1966, 67, and 1970. He was speaking to every Rotary Club and Kiwanis Club and Lions Club and in the state of Georgia. During the course of those years, I practicing law in Atlanta, he running for governor and running his business. When he would be coming up through Atlanta to go to Rome or Clayton or wherever, he would sometimes call me and say, "Are you free? Do you want to ride up with me to Rome?" Giving a speech at noon. Sometimes I would be able to do that and did it, but that was really the extent of our relationship, our association. Back to Curbo, Mr. Curbo was an extraordinary trial lawyer. Again, as you well know, he had represented Jimmy in the 1962 election for the state senate that Jimmy lost because the race was stolen from him. He retained Mr. Curbo, who had been a lawyer in Bainbridge, Georgia. That's where he made his reputation as a great trial lawyer and a fine lawyer. But he had been called, sort of invited up to Atlanta to become a senior partner at King & Spalding. And when Jimmy hired him to represent him in that governor's race dispute, that Senate race dispute, state Senate, Charlie came down from Atlanta to do it. And they won, of course. And Jimmy went into the state Senate. I was associated with Charlie in the law firm and in practice. And in the course of time, he being the age of my father, he became one of the most important men in my life. He was unquestionably, to me, a mentor, a teacher, a friend, sometimes an advocate when I needed advocacy of some kind or another. And I think there's no question in my mind, at least, Bob, that my association with Jimmy, I attribute to and I owe to Charles Curbo.
Mm-hmm. So Jimmy was elected governor in 1970.
Yes. And
he offered you a position in his administration.
He did. A little background on that is that unlike Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell, who were working very closely with Jimmy in that 70 race, Hamilton had even worked for him in the 66 race, if I recall. I'm not certain about that, but I think that he did while he was in college. Yeah. But by the 1970 race, Hamilton was very, very much a part of Jimmy Carter's team, as was Jody. And I think probably as was Frank Moore by that time. I was drawn into it because, well, I just thought of something that I haven't thought of in a long time. Jimmy was going to give a speech to the Downtown Rotary Club, which is probably the most prominent men's and women's business club in the city of Atlanta. And it was on or about May 1st, May Day, Law Day. Must have been 1970. And he called me and said he was going to give a speech around Law Day to the Rotary Club, and if I had any thoughts, he would welcome them for the speech. Well, I took that very seriously. I hope I'm not going into something that you don't want to hear about here, but as I say, it just rushed back into my head. I sat down and I thought about it. That was the time when President Nixon and Vice President Spiro Agnew were constantly talking about law and order. Law and order, law and order. There were a lot of code words that they were using with respect to that phrase. And the short of the story is that I worked around a theme in a letter. I actually wrote it in the form of a letter to Jimmy. And I said something like this. There's been a lot of talk, there is a lot of talk these days about law and order. But laws can be unjust, and order can be repressive. So what Americans really mean when they use the phrase law and order is fair laws within a framework of justice. Well, and I developed that theme in a few paragraphs with some historical allusions. He gave the speech. I did not go. I was not invited to the speech. But the next day, I pick up the morning Atlanta Constitution, and Jimmy's speech is reported, and the subheading on the front page is Carter calls for law and order within a framework of justice. One of the most thrilling moments of my life. I thought, goodness gracious. In any event, I had also, by that time, I had been counsel to the Metropolitan Atlanta Crime Commission. I was very fortunate to be asked, right after I got to Atlanta to start practicing law, by Frank Shackelford, who was a senior partner over at Alston, Miller and Gaines, and who was the current chairman of that. Griffin Bell had been the founding chairman of the commission the year before. So this was the second year of the Atlanta Crime Commission, as it was called. And I was asked if I would be one of the young counsel, pro bono counsel to the Crime Commission. I asked permission from my seniors at King and Spalding. They said yes. And so I did that. And that led me into an interest in mental health. It led me, I wrote a report for Governor Maddox and the mayor and the city council of Atlanta and the county commissions of DeKalb and Fulton on a big problem we were having in Atlanta. Atlanta had the highest drunk arrest rate in the United States, something like 57,000 drunk arrests. And the people were just rotating in and out of the drunk tank in jail. The Supreme Court had passed a decision called Powell v. Texas, which said that you could not jail an alcoholic. And most of the folks that were being run through our drunk tanks and our municipal courts were alcoholics. So the governor of Georgia at that time, Governor Maddox, and as I say, the city of Atlanta and the two county commissions commissioned a study, which they asked me to head, on what to do about it, how we could change our system. And I wrote that report for the governor and the counties and the city. That led me into mental health, and I had, by 1972, I guess, I'd become very, very active in the Mental Health Association of Metropolitan Atlanta and had been elected president of that. The reason I mention that is because in 70 and 71, the first year of his governorship, Carter had convened a very informal, small group of folk to work on his goals for Georgia. And one of the goals for Georgia, of course, was social services, human services, welfare services, public health, mental health facilities. And I had worked on that aspect of the government reorganization for the governor, so that when he was elected, another one of his big promises and pledges to the people of Georgia was to reorganize the whole state government, which had not been done since Governor Richard Russell had done it in the early 1930s. Part of that reorganization was the creation of the Georgia Department of Human Resources, which was the largest department because it aggregated or consolidated public health, mental health, welfare, the Family and Children's Services Department. And it was a very controversial piece of the overall reorganization because it had upset so many fiefdoms and consolidated into one large organization. So many organizations and services that had been spread all over the government. He first asked me if I would leave law practice and become commissioner of that new department. And I was very flattered about that, surprised too that he would ask me. But I couldn't because of some obligations that I had with the law firm in a very big trial that was coming up. So I declined. And just a couple of weeks later, he came back to me and said, I understand why you couldn't leave law practice and become the commissioner, but will you become the chairman of the board of the Department of Human Resources, which was a policy-making board, not advisory. And I did that. And so for the full term of his governorship, after I was appointed in 1972, after the reorganization passed, I chaired that board. And did it actually into Governor Busby's term, who succeeded Governor Carter, and resigned from that board only when I went to Washington.
Did you work at all with the legislature during the process of passing the reorganization bill?
I didn't. I did not do that. Frank Moore and Hamilton were leaders. Of course, Jimmy's allies in the Georgia House and Senate were helping him. He had a small group of friends and supporters and colleagues in the Georgia legislature who helped him push that through. It was very, as I say, very controversial, and I think the overall reorganization or the Department of Human Resources aspect of it passed by only one vote in the Senate. So it was that much of a controversy. But no, I did not have any lobbying responsibilities.
Were you involved in other efforts in the administration, like the budgeting process?
I was only involved in the budgeting as it pertained to the Department of Human Resources. We hired a young man named Richard Hardin to be the commissioner of the department, a very able young man who did a fine job. And subsequently, when Richard stepped down as commissioner, Jim Parham, a friend of mine who had worked on the goals for Georgia, he'd been one of the people working on the human services aspect of the government reorganization plan for Governor Carter. And Jim and I had become very close friends. Jim became the commissioner of the department. I continued as chairman. So I was involved in the budget only as it pertained to the budget of the Department of Human Resources.
By the end of 1974, which was toward the end of Carter's term as governor, you became involved with a group to help plan his 1976 campaign for president. If I remember correctly, you were one of the originals in that group, and you began sort of a fundraising campaign for him in Georgia.
I don't remember the date, Bob, but there came a time, I did not know anything about the governor's plans to run for president. I was not, unlike Hamilton and Frank and Jody, who were all working for the governor. I was still practicing law and on the outside, and my contact was only really through the Department of Human Resources and those responsibilities. But I was not an insider to that. I continued to be very close to Curbo, but Curbo had not said anything to me about that until one day, and I don't really remember if it was Charlie or if I got a call from the governor's office to ask me if I could have supper out at the governor's mansion. And I did, having no idea what it was about. And it was at that little informal gathering of people with the governor that he said, in my presence for the first time, the others already knew about it, I think, that he was going to run for president. At that little gathering, if my memory serves me, Jody and Hamilton and Frank and Stu Eisenstadt, Bob Lipschutz, who'd been very instrumental on the finance side in the 1970 governor's race for Governor Carter, and a fine, very respected lawyer in the city of Atlanta. And Charles Curbo, those are the people that I remember being there. There might have been another one or two, but I don't remember any others. And that was the very first time that I learned of the plan.
Mm-hmm. But you signed on immediately.
I did. Of course I did.
Well, at that point, most of his financial support was coming from Georgia until the Pennsylvania primary.
One of the things that Curbo and the governor asked me to do, and it was kind of informal. I don't know that I ever had any title, but I was working on raising money in Georgia, and I might have had some title of chairman of the Georgia committee or something, but it's not important. Whatever. I was traveling around the state and meeting with small groups, trying to raise money. Overwhelmingly, most of the money that he had until Iowa and New Hampshire was coming from Georgia. I'm not really sure about this, Bob, so I wouldn't want to go down on the historic record with this, but I think our budget, the campaign's budget in Iowa, this will make people's eyes roll back in their heads thinking about the billions of dollars now being spent on presidential campaigns. I think our total budget for Iowa was like $20,000. Practically everybody was a volunteer. Tim Kraft from New Mexico had gone up there to organize Iowa. Chris Brown was organizing in New Hampshire. They had put together very small staffs of people, 5 or 6 people. Carter had made the decision early on to run everywhere, and Jimmy, being the careful, thoughtful, meticulous planner that he is, he was focusing on delegate count, and he knew that delegate count in the final analysis was going to count a lot more than polls. The big joke, of course, when Jimmy decided to run for president all over the country was Jimmy who running for what? He was undaunted and undeterred by all that and just set about it in his disciplined way. And as I say, until he started breaking into the national consciousness with his victory in the Iowa caucuses, and then his plurality victory in New Hampshire, he was suddenly being viewed as a legitimate and serious candidate for the presidency, and money started coming in from other parts of the country. Mm-hmm. But in those early days, Georgia was funding his primary campaign, and I had a modest role in that.
But there became a point when Pennsylvania became very important. And you were involved in that.
Well, here, I wasn't really involved, and here again, during the campaign, Hamilton was, of course, central to the whole effort. He had written the famous memorandum to Jimmy, I think maybe in late 1972, maybe November, very late, I think, is when Hamilton did that memorandum that has come to be so famous. And Hamilton, after everything got underway, Jimmy, we haven't mentioned, Jimmy was appointed by whoever does the appointing, maybe the DNC chairman, Bob Strauss, I'm not really sure. But for the 74 midterm elections, Governor Carter was named chair, or whatever the title was, for the Democratic midterm elections. Well, I think in the past, that title had been more or less honorary. But again, typical of Jimmy Carter, and part of his plan for running for the presidency was to make the very most of that role in the country for him. He traveled all over the country. They were holding seminars and symposiums for candidates, how to run for office and so forth. And Jimmy was doing more with that role, with Hamilton's help, of course, and Jody's help, than anybody had ever done with it. And as a result of that 1974 midterm election, which turned out to be very successful for the Democrats, I don't remember the numbers, but they were big.
45 new House members.
That sounds about right.
4 new senators.
It was a very successful midterm election. And again, Jimmy, little by little, gradually is putting himself more on the national stage and making contacts all over the country, quietly. Interestingly enough, Bob, on a national level, not at all unlike what he did when he ran for governor the second time between 66 and 70, just quietly getting around all over the state, making speeches all over the state, meeting and making friends and acquaintances with people in cities and towns all over Georgia. He was very much below the radar in that 66 to 70 period, and it wasn't until 1970 when he of course ran against Carl Sanders, predominantly Carl, that it began to be known to the established Democrats and the establishment in the state, the business establishment in the state, that this man, Jimmy Carter, had been working on this for some time. Well, he did pretty much the same thing on a national level, I think. Mm-hmm. Now, Pennsylvania primary. I had been an enthusiastic supporter of the presidential bid through from the first moment, because I thought he would be a fine president. I thought he had everything we're looking for in a man or a woman to be president of the United States. Intelligence, a good heart, someone who works very hard, someone who's interested in public policy and studies public policy, someone whose social views and fiscal views and monetary views were consistent with what I thought in my limited way to be right for the country. He had won, as I said, the caucuses in Iowa, the first primary in New Hampshire. He went on to win Florida. That was very big, and Phil Wise had a big role. Phil Wise had a very big role in organizing Florida for Jimmy in that 76 run, and he beat George Wallace in Florida. So he was establishing himself in the farm states of the Midwest, in the New England states through New Hampshire and Maine. He won Maine as well. I think Sissy Dalvin, his mother's sister, had been living over in Maine and just making friends right and left. Sissy was a wonderful woman, wonderful woman. And then down into the South, winning in Florida, winning in North Carolina. All of this extraordinary and sort of unbelievable in a way. Then he goes into Pennsylvania, a Union state. Senator Scoop Jackson of Washington State, very, very popular with organized labor in the country. Again, I don't trust my memory, but I think Jimmy beat Scoop by 12 points or something like that in the Pennsylvania primary. That was at the very end of April, maybe April 30th.
April 27th.
April 27th. Thank you, Bob.
It really knocked Jackson
out of the race. Jackson withdrew from the race after Pennsylvania. And Scoop Jackson was a very prominent United States senator, well respected, and a national figure in the Democratic Party and beyond the party. But after Jimmy won in Pennsylvania, and won so substantially, Scoop Jackson pulled out. When Jimmy won the Pennsylvania primary, I, being sort of slow on the uptake sometimes, realized privately to myself that he was going to be president. And it was the first time that I had really absorbed the reality of that prospect. And I set about working on a memorandum because I was thinking, here's a man who's never been a United States congressman, a United States senator. He's never been in the cabinet. He's never been a figure in the National Democratic Party. His national standing he's building sort of brick by brick and primary by primary as he's running for the Democratic nomination. Doing transition planning for anyone who has a strong shot at the presidency is wise, certainly a nominee. But for Jimmy, it seemed to me to be even more necessary because he lacked the networks that so many people who run for president have in and around Washington, D.C. and nationally. So I wrote a memorandum in which I was suggesting, I haven't read this memorandum in a long time, so don't ask me to quote it, but I was making the case for his establishing a small, low profile, no profile if possible, group to start quietly planning for the possible presidency, the Carter presidency. I did not send that memorandum to Jimmy. I sent it to Curbo. And honestly, I don't remember if I'd even discussed with Curbo before I gave him the memo that I was doing it, what I was thinking about. I might have, but I don't remember. I knew that if Curbo thought it was a good idea, he would give the memorandum to Jimmy, which he did. And I got back that memo with, again, as was Jimmy's custom, with just the shortest, briefest note in his own handwriting at the upper right-hand corner saying, flesh this out, in effect. I don't remember the note in particular, but he said, do this. Think about this more, or whatever. I was excited, and so I set about talking to folk and trying to put together something really concrete that I could give him by early June. I think the last primary that year, Bob, was on June the 6th, if I'm not mistaken, about that time. So I wanted to give him something around that time that would flesh it out, and I did. And I basically broke down in the second memorandum, which was sent directly to Jimmy with a copy to Curbo, the plan for the transition team. It would be organized this way. It would focus on these 6 or 7 broad areas: national defense, the environment, budget issues, government reorganization issues, foreign affairs. And I even, if I remember correctly, I don't know how I came up with this, but I, talking to folk and trying to figure it out, and again, relying on people volunteering their services. Nobody was going to be paid to come do this with the team, with the transition team. And getting free space somewhere in Atlanta to put the folk to work, you know. And I gave that to him, and around the 1st of June, and didn't hear back from him. Well, he wins the last primaries, I think, or June 6th or so. And I think on June 8th, he called me from Plains and said he was coming up to Atlanta to give a speech. He now had the delegates to be the nominee. Everybody knew it. And incidentally, the liberal wing of the party, of the Democratic Party, as Carter got stronger and stronger and stronger and started winning more and more delegates, there was a kind of anybody but Carter movement that informally got organized in the Democratic Party, and that sort of spawned a Jerry Brown challenge at the last minute. And the man who was running second to Jimmy, I think, in delegate count was Mo Udall from Arizona, a fine man. I admired Mo Udall greatly. He'd been a fine congressman, a very funny man, a great humorist and great speech maker. But in any event, notwithstanding that sort of late anybody but Carter challenge to him in the late part of the primaries, post-Pennsylvania, he still prevailed. He said, "I'm coming up. I want you to fly back down to Plains with me. I want to talk to you." I'm very excited because I'm hoping and assuming that he wants to talk to me about the transition. I should tell you that a key element of my recommendation to him about the transition team, the transition planning team, was that he asked some prominent person, and I even had a candidate in mind, John Gardner. John Gardner was a man that I greatly admired. He'd written numerous books on politics and public policy and leadership. He had been the secretary of HEW under President Kennedy. He was a Stanford professor. He was a literate, erudite man of public policy and public service of almost of no parallel in my mind. And I said to Jimmy in the memoranda, he would be perfect. He would be the perfect kind of person to head your transition planning. Everybody knows him. Everybody respects him. He's knowledgeable. We get on the plane. It's just Jimmy and me. That little single engine plane that he flew around the state in. Can't remember the pilot's name, I'm sorry. And we're sitting together facing each other, sort of almost knee to knee like this. Over the roar of the engine, he said, "I want to do the transition. I want to do what you've outlined in terms of transition planning. It's a good idea, and I want to get it started along the lines that you've said." Words to that effect. I'm so excited. And I said, that's great. By this time, of course, he's not governor. He's out of the governor's office. And I said, "That's great, Jimmy. I'm so pleased, and I'll help in any way I can. Whom are you going to ask to head this effort?" hoping that it would be John Gardner. And he said, looking at me with those blue eyes of his, "You." And I said, not out of modesty at all, but out of knowledge. I said, "Jimmy, no, I don't know enough to do this. People don't know me. I'm a know-nothing lawyer from Atlanta, Georgia. We need somebody to do this who's prominent and national and has networks." He said, "No, it's going to be you." And I think I may have even said, "Why? I'm not the man." And he said, "Because I know you, and you know me, you know what I want to do, and I trust you to do that. That's why." And he said, furthermore, when people around the country, particularly the Democrats, know what you're doing, know what I've asked you to do, to put together some transition planning and documents and so forth for my possible administration, there's no Democrat in the country that won't return your phone call. He was right. He was right about that.
So what happened then?
We started. I was kind of overwhelmed, really. Excited and overwhelmed, not because I was reluctant to undertake it. I thought he had made a mistake in asking me to head it, but that was his decision, so I was going with it. And I began then, as I had not done at all before, Bob, to call people and to put the word out to people on the Hill, people that did not know me from Adam. I called Jack Brooks, Congressman Jack Brooks from Texas, because he had the committee or the subcommittee that would fund transition planning. Ultimately, I called Phil Landrum, Congressman Phil Landrum, our very distinguished congressman, sort of dean of our delegation at that time. And as word started getting around, I'll give you an example of what sort of thing happened. I got a handwritten letter from Senator Philip Hart of Michigan, for whom the Hart office building, Senate office building, is named in Washington, D.C. now. Senator Hart was one of the most respected men in the national government. I knew of him. Of course, I didn't know any of these people personally. But Senator Hart, who had cancer and who would die in the not too distant future, wrote me this as I recall, 3-page letter recommending to me a young man on his staff named Harrison Welford. He said, "This is the kind of young person that I think will be of great help to you in doing this transition planning." And he undertook to tell me about Harrison and to give him his unqualified recommendation for this kind of work. I called Harrison Welford, and Harrison Welford came to Atlanta and started working with me on the transition. And without detailing other stories of that nature, that's really sort of the most special one. I got another handwritten letter. This is all, of course, long before emails and texts and such. I got a long letter from Pat Anderson, who was the speechwriter for Jimmy on the campaign trail. I'd met Pat, but we were not friends. But again, Pat took the time and trouble to sit down on the campaign trail and to write me a letter about another individual. Alan Novak was his name, a brilliant lawyer, lived in Washington, D.C., had clerked for Justice Brennan on the United States Supreme Court, just a few years older than myself. And he said, Alan is the kind of person that he's had some experience with government in the Kennedy administration as a young staffer, and he's just smart as he can be. I called Alan Novak, Met him on one of my trips to Washington. Alan Novak became a very important cog in this team. And so on around. And just by word of mouth and in many cases people making direct applications to me to work on it from around the country, we put together a small team of people to start doing the transition planning in accordance with the sort of outline of subject matter and organized in the way I had suggested. It was modified as we went along, but that was basically the template for what we did throughout the summer of 1976. The campaign, the Democratic campaign, was in July, if I recall. The convention, I should say. And Jimmy, of course, prevailed, although Ted Kennedy later, in 76, it went smoothly. It was later in the 80 convention that things started coming apart with Ted Kennedy refusing to give up his bid. But in 76, we just cruised right in. Mm-hmm. And that was I was there, of course, for that convention, and I was able to meet and make contacts with people at the Democratic convention who wanted to help too. But during the summer, July, really getting underway in earnest, August, September, October, this small dedicated group of hard-working folk put together briefing books for the president, big loose-leaf briefing books. If it had been anybody other than Jimmy Carter, I wouldn't have done it in that way. But I knew, having worked with Jimmy in the way that I had during his governorship, that Jimmy wanted to know, that he would read what was given to him and sort through it and assimilate it and organize it in his own mind and make his judgments about which way to go. An important thing, Bob, is that in transition planning is you're not planning for an administration. You're planning for the first 3 months of the administration. What issues are going to be thrust upon you that you can pretty well predict? Some you won't be able to predict. What initiatives on the part of the president-elect will he want to undertake immediately? Budget, government organization, or otherwise. That was another reason we had to go back to Jack Brooks, because Jack Brooks was going to be very key in funding our transition actually in Washington. And he passed increasing a bill increasing the funding for the transition effort. To my knowledge, and I'm no professional historian by any stretch, but to my knowledge, no one had ever done it this way. No one had ever gone about it in this thorough and organized way. Since we did it, mm-hmm. Others have done it almost without exception. For example, one of the great Americans that I called and asked if I could come see him in Washington, this would have been early in the summer of '76, was Clark Clifford. Mm-hmm. Clark Clifford had been Secretary of Defense under President Johnson and President Kennedy. President Kennedy. But more importantly, for my purposes, he had sort of been the informal head of Kennedy's transition planning. And Mr. Clifford, who was one of the most prominent wise men, lawyers, and Democrats in the country, said, of course. He was a very courtly man, tall, handsome, gray-headed, great lawyer, a man that I'd read about. I went to his law office there on 16th Street, just 2 blocks from the White House, and he couldn't have been more accommodating and courteous and helpful to me than he was. But the transition file that he gave me was about that big, honestly. And it was, his advice to me was sort of a general nature, the do's and don'ts do's and don'ts about the transitioning from one government to another government, things to be on the lookout for. But in terms of the kind of specific, concrete, organized planning that we had been doing for 3 months, and that we were submitting to Jimmy Carter as president-elect in November when he won the election, there'd been nothing of that nature. Now maybe the reason that there hadn't been was because they knew so much more than we did, than I did, and it just came more naturally to them. Of course, Kennedy had been a United States Senator and had networks in Washington and New York and Boston and around the country that we didn't have. But in any event, whatever the reason, I was able to, in talking to folks and getting help from a lot of very, very capable, competent, intelligent young men and women, to put together all this work for the president. I delivered it to him maybe 2 days after the election, and he took these massive books, organized as we had outlined, and started in on them. And he asked me if I would be the transition director, and I said yes, sir.
Somewhere I read that President Carter remained in Plains.
He did.
For a long period of time after the election.
One of the questions was whether or not the president-elect would relocate to Washington. And Jimmy said, I don't want to do that. I want to do this from Georgia. And I said, yes, sir. We'll do it that way. Mondale, of course, had been nominated as his vice president and elected as his vice president by November. And a very interesting time for me, Bob, was when I called the White House and spoke to the President's Ford, President's Chief of Staff, who was Dick Cheney. And I introduced myself. He was expecting the call. He was very cordial, couldn't have been nicer to me on the telephone. He said, you need to come up here and let me talk to you and meet you, and the President Ford will designate a transition director for the outgoing administration. It was not going to be Dick. It was going to be Jack Marsh, who later became Secretary of the Army under President Reagan. Jack Marsh was an old friend and counselor in the White House to President Ford, and a very fine man. I went up to Washington as some of my friends said, the first Georgian to cross the Potomac after the Carter election, which wasn't really true because Frank Moore had been living in Washington for a long time, and Hamilton had spent more time up there than anybody. But on behalf of the president-elect, I suppose that was true. I went to the White House. I was met by Dick Cheney in the Chief of Staff's office there in the West Wing, and Jack Marsh, who would be my counterpart for President Ford, and others, the press secretary of President Ford, and others. And of course, they were shocked. They were in a state of sort of shocked disbelief. Again, as you know, although President Carter came out of the Democratic convention with a 30-something point lead, at one point it could have been 41% or something, 41 point, but a huge lead in excess of 30 points. Over time, during the course of the general election campaign, that narrowed to less than 2%. And I think the final popular vote in the 1976 election was 50.1% to 48.9. That's how close it was. Mm-hmm. And what's even scarier to a Carter man, to us Carter folk, was that, I mean, just 2,000 or 3,000 votes in Hawaii, 4,000 or 5,000 votes in Ohio would have gone the other way. So it was a cliffhanger. They didn't declare the winner until 3:30, 3:45, 4 o'clock a.m. the morning after the election. That's how close it was. I read, I didn't know this at the time. Well, yes, I did know it, but I didn't really focus on the significance of it. Jimmy won 23 states in the District of Columbia, something like that, edging in the popular vote. He had 297 electoral votes. Ford had 240. But as I say, just a few thousand votes here or there would have flipped it. Jerry Ford took 27 states. And you'll have to check me on this, but I believe I read that in the history of the Republic, no losing candidate for president has ever won 27 states and not become president. So that's how close it was. We began after the transition. Oh, here's something that, as an old politician yourself, Bob, you'll smile at. We finished our meeting in the West Wing with Cheney and so forth. I was the only one there from Carter's side. And the press secretary, and I'm blocking his name right now, I'm embarrassed, but the president's press secretary said, "Jack, the White House press corps is waiting outside the West Wing. I will, if you don't want to deal with them now, we'll take you out the side door of the West Wing and put you in a car there and take you wherever you want to go. Or you can go out and speak to the press corps." And I said, "What do you think I should do?" This is all new to me, Bob. He said, "I think you should do it." I said, "All right." We get to the door, the front door of the West Wing, and I'm looking out, and the press secretary is right there, and I think Dick Cheney is right beside me. And before we open the door, I can see that they've got a rope, and the press, 50 or 60 strong, are there with the television cameras and their microphones and screaming and hollering. It was like a mob. And as we opened the door and I walked out to come speak to them, either Cheney or the press secretary said to me quietly into my ear, "Welcome to Washington, Jack." And the first person who asked me a question was Sam Donaldson, and the only reason he was first because he was shouting the loudest. But so it went.
So he becomes president. What use did he make of your transition plans?
Oh, I think they were. I think he made great use of them. One thing that happened during the transition, and this started a little something in the press that was magnified by the press much more than it was in actuality between Hamilton and me. One of the aspects of the transition planning had been what we call the talent inventory program, for lack of a better phrase. It was, we were getting, once Jimmy was the nominee, we started getting in Atlanta, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of letters and memos and telephone calls of people recommending people or recommending themselves to come into the administration, to a Democratic administration. That had to be dealt with. That had to be organized. we had to do something with all that input that wouldn't lose it. And so the talent inventory program was the aspect of the transition that was dealing with all that input. And I had winnowed that down. I say the able people who were working with me were doing it primarily with my input and guidance. And we had organized it by cabinet categories, and sub-cabinet leader categories, assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, so forth. With all the recommendations and outlines that we had of biographical information and so forth. All that was organized. What all that work did not recognize or include to the degree that it needed to, we couldn't do it. We didn't have the capability to do it, was rewarding all the people who'd worked so hard on the campaign. There were literally people all over the United States who had devoted themselves, some of them for more than a year, to the election of Jimmy Carter, the nomination and then the election of Jimmy Carter, all under Hamilton Jordan's leadership and guidance. He and Frank and Jody and others who had worked so hard on the campaign knew those people, knew who they were, knew what they'd done, knew to some degree what their capabilities were and where they might be slotted. So the first real change to the transition program was that the president said to me, I want Hamilton, I want Hamilton, not let's let. I want Hamilton to assume the leadership of that aspect here because he's got all of that information. He and his
spoils system.
Well, you can call it spoils. I think that's a little unfair because, again, knowing Carter and the Carter team as I did and as I have for all these years, I knew we were going to pick only the best from the campaign supporters to go into these various slots. I knew that Jimmy wanted competence and loyalty, of course, loyalty. Loyalty in politics is one of the most important attributes, in my opinion. A disloyal person ought not to be on your team, no matter how competent they are, he or she is. But so it was the integration of that army of campaign people who had been essential to the nomination and election of Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale that needed to be incorporated in all this material. And so Hamilton took the lead on that. I continued to take the lead on all other aspects of the transition, the department by department interconnects and all of that. And continued to have some input into the cabinet secretaries and so forth. But that was Hamilton's lead as it properly should have been.
Why didn't Carter choose a chief of staff?
That's a very good question, Bob. I will tell you why I think. Others might have a different view. Really two reasons, more or less two reasons. One was that in Hamilton and Jody, Hamilton Jordan, Jody Powell, Frank Moore, Stu Eisenstadt, Jack Watson, Bob Lipschutz. That was sort of the Georgia team, more or less. I hope I'm not leaving someone out. I'll be very embarrassed if I am. And when I say that, I'm just talking about the people who became the senior staff at the White House.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about. Landon Butler, and there were countless other, Jay Beck and Phil Wise. There are countless other people who were crucial to the election and who became critical to the administration in the White House or elsewhere. So I don't mean to leave anybody out. But in terms of what became the senior staff at the White House, the ones I've just named, plus a couple of others that weren't Georgians, I think the president did not want to interpose someone between him and that group of senior trusted folk. He didn't want to pick a first among equals, sort of. He did not want to have either the image or the reality of a palace guard. Haldeman, during the Nixon administration, as President Nixon's chief of staff, had developed a reputation, which was, I later met Bob Haldeman, and he was a better man than history will give him credit for. But he had been a real palace guard. He had excluded people. He had been a kind of martinet, really. He did not suffer fools gladly, and he and others, Ehrlichman among them, but Haldeman as chief of staff in particular, had projected an image of the palace guard around the president as exclusive and demanding and overly protective. Carter did not. He was reacting against that image. That was part of it. He did not want to project that symbolically or in actuality, that system, that approach. And I think the other reason was that Carter knew as he had been in the campaign, he would be in charge. Jimmy Carter we've not talked about him much this morning, but he's one of the most extraordinary men I've ever known in my life. He has an extraordinary capacity for the assimilation of information. He has an extraordinary curiosity about what should be and what should not be, how something should be done or not done, how something should be organized or not, what approach should be taken, what the priorities are. He is a man who has his own mind on these things. And I don't say this in any kind of disparaging or derogatory way, but a man as far away in these respects from Ronald Reagan as you could almost possibly get. And Jimmy knew that about himself. All of us knew that about him. So I think there was a question in Jimmy's mind as to whether or not he really needed someone who would sit just below him and organize. He was going to do that himself. We had been told very specifically by the Ford people not to do that spokes of the wheel thing. Spokes of the wheel meaning the president's at the center and everybody else comes into him. They had warned against it and said, you need a chief of staff. But the president really had made his mind up at the beginning that he, for the reasons stated and whatever other reasons he may have had, that he was not going to do it that way. I had done for him a memorandum that I wrote myself with help, with a lot of input, but that I wrote myself on the organization of the executive office of the president, including the White House staff. And I was trying to give him in that personal memorandum from me to him as part of the transition papers, just my thoughts, the thoughts I had gathered, recommendations I had gathered, the pros and cons I had assembled from various sources about how to do that, how to organize the executive office of the president, including the White House staff. And in that memorandum, I took as a given that he was not going to have a chief of staff, because he had said so. Now, this is an important point to make, I think. Though Hamilton did not function as a chief of staff, and by that I mean organizationally and managerially, although he did not do that, Hamilton was the closest aide in the White House. Hamilton and Jody, I would say. Jody in his unique role as press secretary, and having had the same role for Jimmy for a long time. In terms of, back to Hamilton, in terms of Hamilton's role to the president, he was the one among us who saw the president the most, even before 2 years into the administration he was named chief of staff. I think we may get to this, but we'll talk about how what roles and the responsibilities I was given by the president and Hamilton and Stu and others, if you want to go into that.
I do.
So we will get to that. But for example, the chief of staff's office, that office in the West Wing, which sits on the southwest corner of the West Wing, just a few steps away from the Oval Office. Hamilton took that office. He was not the White House chief of staff, and was not so designated, and was not given by the president the full responsibilities of a chief of staff until well into the 2 years at least into the administration. But Hamilton was sitting in that office.
So what was Jack Watson doing during that period?
I did not know what the president was going to ask me to do. I'd spent all this time thinking about how to organize the White House staff and the executive office of the president and the functions of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and so forth. So I really thought a lot about it, and I was the beneficiary, the recipient of a lot of information and a lot of recommendations and suggestions from people who'd been there before. But I didn't know what the president was going to ask me to do. Late in the transition period, sometime well, not so late, but in December, or before Christmas, he called me in and he said, I want you to have two hats, two roles, and I'll explain why. He said, when I was governor of a sovereign state in the United States of America, on those rare occasions when I really felt I needed to have contact with the president, I couldn't get to him. I couldn't really get to anybody that was even talking to him. He said, that's not going to be the way it is in my administration. He said, one of my highest priorities is going to be to have my presidency, me as president, my presidency and my White House staff, open and accessible to the state and local leaders of the country, the governors, the mayors, particularly the big city mayors, and so on, the county commissioners. Not so much the state legislators, because that's a little bit different role, but the executive functions at the state and local levels. I want, in cases where they really need to have access and contact with my White House, I want them to be able to do it. Therefore, I want you to be on the senior staff as assistant to the president for intergovernmental affairs. In that role, you will represent and explain what we're doing to the governors and other state and local leaders of the country. You will be my spokesperson, my spokesman to them, explaining and advocating and you will be their conduit to me. You will give me the benefit as you think appropriate of the most important things they're saying, or the most important problems that they're suffering, that they're dealing with, and so forth. But that's the role. He said the other role I want you to have is it's a new role. We've had it before. It was in my transition papers, but he redefined it, and it was Secretary to the Cabinet, or Secretary of the Cabinet. The Secretary to the Cabinet, the President said, will be my coordinator of interdepartmental activities. Nothing ever gets done, almost ever, that's of any scope or importance that involves only one department of government. If you're talking about urban policy, you're talking about certainly the Department of HUD and the Department of Commerce, the Department of Transportation. You're talking about the Economic Development Agency within Commerce. If you're talking about defense, it's relating to the Department of State and so forth. What that role evolved into, Bob, was really exciting, because it was the coordination of the execution of domestic policy. Stu Eisenstadt, we can talk about this more if you wish, Stu Eisenstadt was the assistant to the president for domestic policy. Stu's one of the hardest working and brightest guys and most diligent, persistent guys I've ever met. He served the president very well, in my judgment. He was the one working on the formulation of the president's proposals to the Congress. What shall our domestic policy be? What shall our economic policies be? He was the chief of policy formation and formulation. Once the policies are formulated and manifested in laws, in most administrations, the ball is dropped. Who's going to coordinate the execution of the policy? Who's going to coordinate national urban policy? Well, in the president's view, and no other president has done this to this extent ever, and I don't know why they haven't followed his lead. I really don't. Was this concept of having one of his senior-most aides coordinating with the cabinet, interlocking the coordinated cabinet activities with the needs and demands of the state and local government where the policies are hitting the ground. And so his marriage of those two functions, those two responsibilities, was a really, really important function, a really important concept. And that's basically what he asked me to do. As a consequence of that, it sort of fell naturally to me to represent the president in speaking around the country to state events, governor's events. When the president couldn't come at a governor's request or a big city mayor's request or whatever, I was sort of one of the logical guys, the most logical guy on the senior White House staff to do that, which meant that my responsibilities, unlike Stu's and Hamilton's and Frank's with the Congress, were outward-looking, outward-reaching to the country rather than Washington-centered. It was a big difference. It was a role that I thought I had to define because, as I'm trying to say here, nobody had ever done it quite this way. No other president had quite envisioned this arrangement or this sort of coupling of responsibilities. No other president, to my knowledge, had ever set at such a high priority this state and local connection with Washington, and the accessibility of all those leaders to the president and his policies and his people. So to a large extent, we sort of had to make it up as we went, but it worked out well. This is probably a good time to tell you one quick thing as to how well this worked. In 1979, I want to say July of 1979, things are heating up for the 80 presidential campaign for reasons that we may discuss later if you wish. The president's popularity was down. Panama Canal, hostages were to be taken in the fall of '79. But the economic inflation was bad. The price of oil, because of OPEC's policies and practices, was going up 10% a month practically. We'd been through the scarring battle of the Panama Canal treaties. President Carter has said on more than one occasion that that was the hardest thing he ever did in public life in terms of policy making. I think that's right. And it also was politically damaging to him. But in July, the summer of 1979, with all the talk about Kennedy making a bid for the nomination against an incumbent Democratic president, and the president's popularity was low. His approval rating was down in the 20s, 28, 30%. We were going to have a National Governors Association meeting in Louisville, Kentucky, because I think at the time the chairman of the National Governors Association was the governor of Kentucky. Usually those events are held in Washington, but this was sort of a mid-year event. And I had been, by that time, all of '77, all of '78, half of '79, I had been, to the best of my ability, and with a very, very, very able staff, been trying to do what the president had tasked me with doing, which was working collaboratively and cooperatively with the cabinet, and particularly the domestic cabinet, and the governors, in particular the governors and the big city mayors, in solving their problems and executing the policies and so forth. We were going into that National Governors Association meeting at a time when the president's popularity was low and when he needed to have something good happening. And so I went into to Hamilton's office. Jody was there, and I said, I know I want to tell you something that I want to do. I know it's a little risky, but I'm pretty sure we can do it. I want to get a resolution from all the Democratic governors in support of the president's renomination and reelection. I think we can do it. Jim Hunt, the governor of North Carolina, he may have been head of the Democratic caucus, the Democratic Governors Caucus, as I recall. And Jody and Hamilton said, "Oh my goodness," he said, if you go for it and don't get it, it's going to be really embarrassing." I said, "Well, I think I can manage it in a way that I won't really make the final push until I know I've got it, And at that time, the governor of Oklahoma the Oklahomans were not supporting Carter. Oklahoma was one of the only southern states. Oklahoma and Virginia were the only two southern states that he didn't carry in the 1976 election. That's never been done since. He didn't do it in '80 at all, as you know. But lots of problems on the oil and gas. His energy policies, it made him unpopular, Oklahoma. And Hugh Carey, the governor of New York, was Hugh Carey, the Black Irishman, as he was known. Interesting man. And he'd been critical of the president for various reasons. The governor of Maine was a close Kennedy ally and friend, personal friend and ally, and so I knew I had problems there. Short of the story is, as I remember, there were 28 Democratic governors at the time. The ones that I couldn't get, Oklahoma and Maine, I got to abstain. And we got a unanimous as to all the rest of the governors, a unanimous resolution in support of the president's renomination and election as president. The reason I tell that story is that it's one of the best testaments I can give to the president's wisdom in paying attention to how you execute your domestic policy and how you work with and not dictate to the governors of the states of the nation and the big city mayors. If you're talking to them, if you're listening to them, if you're doing more than lip service to their concerns and their problems, if you're able, sort of out of your right hand with your role as cabinet coordinator and your relationship with not only the secretaries of the domestic departments, but the key operating assistant secretaries for housing and for urban development and so forth. If you can really bring to bear in a coordinated way, as we could, solutions to their problems, you're going to have a president who's popular with those state and local leaders. And that's what happened. I mean, that's really what happened because of Carter's vision. In 78, early 78, when we formulated the National Comprehensive Urban Policy and a separate Small Community and Rural Development Policy, they went sort of parallel to each other. At my recommendation, with Stu's substantial input, we created something called the Interagency Coordinating Council, which by executive order I chaired.
ICC.
IACC, yes, IACC. And that Interagency Coordinating Council, created by executive order of the president, designating me as the chair of the council, was the federal coordinated collaborative mechanism for executing domestic policy throughout the country. And it worked. It really worked. And when Jay Rockefeller called me as governor of West Virginia at the time and said, "Jack, my God," he said, "we got the urban redevelopment policy here that wants us to revitalize our center cities." And he said, "We've got a transportation policy that's building interstates, and doing interstate exchanges and pulling people out of the center city. We got to get these people together. We need some way to get these people at the same table talking so that we're not operating at cross purposes, and we, the states and cities, are being caught in the crossfire here." The Interagency Coordinating Council addressed that and solved that problem just by getting the right people in the room at the federal level, which I could do, with the right people in the same room at the state and local level to talk with each other, And it worked. It just worked. It's not easy. It's not easy to get those things done. And you're going to have a lot of differences of opinion, but you can't resolve differences of opinion if you're not, if the right people aren't sitting at the table. One of the really, really, really big differences between government then and government now was that it wasn't that we didn't have lots of differences of opinion among lots of people, but it was rather that then people knew that politics was the art, not a science, but the art of compromise and conciliation. And you could get people who thought this way, talking to people who thought this way together and compromise. We're not doing that now in this government. We're not doing it at the federal level at all, it seems. And that is a terrible and crippling reality for the nation right now. I don't want to go off on some other tangent, but I was very much involved in the Panama Canal, selling of the Panama Canal Treaties, because I was bringing in people from the states to be briefed by the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense and the people that were negotiating the treaties and the President himself, giving cover to the senators so they could have some support back home to what was on its face an unpopular thing to do. So I was very much involved in all of that. One of the most successful political organizing and political selling of an idea that I've ever seen in my life. I've ever been a part of. I was a small part of it, but I was privileged to be part of it. And I remember so well that Howard Baker, the Senate Minority Leader, he wasn't just helpful. He was essential to the success of that effort. Working with Bob Byrd as the majority leader and Tip O'Neill as the speaker and the president. He brought, again, my memory doesn't serve me so well sometimes, but I think Howard brought like 17, 18 senators along with that very difficult vote. Anyway, those were the roles that the president gave me. We can talk about others if you like, with Stu and the others.
Jack, you worked extensively with the Carter cabinet. Tell us about the cabinet.
It probably won't surprise you, Bob, for me to say that I have and had at the time and have always retained a very high opinion of the cabinet that he selected. I would also point out to you that there were most of the cabinet members under in Carter's presidency remained the whole time. There were a few that left, not many, and the others stayed the entire time, which is unusual in and of itself. The cabinet. Cyrus Vance, of course, was Secretary of State, and it needs really no introduction from me. He was one of the most distinguished sort of national statesmen of the country and had been for some time. He'd served in previous administrations in a variety of positions. He had been a negotiator at various times and a sort of special emissary of the president, previous presidents. So he was extremely well qualified, in my opinion, to be Secretary of State. And I know the president felt exactly the same way about him. Zbigniew Brzezinski was not a member of the cabinet, but was a national security advisor, and should be mentioned here because he was a critical and important member of the White House senior staff, and the president relied greatly on him. Secretary of Defense was Harold Brown. I won't go through the entire cabinet necessarily, but Harold Brown was a brilliant man, and in my opinion, a first-rate Secretary of State. He was thoughtful. He was not impulsive. He was an academic, so he was extremely well informed and well educated on matters of defense policy, national security, and international affairs, and was not a flamboyant man, so he was not, as some secretaries of defense have been, a high-profile public figure. But I can tell you that he was well respected and relied upon within the administration as Secretary of Defense. I worked with him a lot, particularly when the Mariel Harbor boat lift all started, and I had to organize military assets with the Secretary's strong help and the Joint Chiefs' strong help to deal with that influx of about 140,000 Cubans coming across the Florida Straits into South Florida. That's another story. Cecil Andrus was the Secretary of the Interior. He had been and was to be, after the administration, again the governor of Idaho. Cecil Andrus was and is a capable man. He and the president had been friends when they were both governors, and I worked extensively with Cecil Andrus on matters related to water issues, water problems, water challenges in the West and others, drought problems and so forth. Bob Berglund had been a congressman from Minnesota, and Bob Berglund was Secretary of Agriculture. He was a quiet-spoken, very articulate man. Again, not a grandstander. The president in his cabinet did not have a lot of showboats, a lot of show horses. He had a lot of working horses, people of experience, people who knew their jobs, came to their jobs with a wealth of information and background and experience in the jobs that the president was giving them, whether in agriculture or the interior or defense or state. And again, for the reasons that I've covered previously, I was working extensively with these men and women. Pat Harris was the Secretary of HUD to begin with, Housing and Urban Development. Pat was a prickly woman, African-American woman, a woman of strong opinions, a capable woman who was not shy at all in advocating her interests and the interests of her department. The president had high respect for her, as was evidenced by the fact that in 1979 he asked Pat to move from HUD as secretary over to the Department of Health and Human Services, which had previously been called HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. And so Pat moved from HUD over to Health and Human Services and became secretary there, evidencing the president's strong opinion of her capabilities to have her as secretaries of two of his departments. Secretary of Commerce was Juanita Krebs. Juanita Krebs was a scholar. She came out of Duke University. She was a soft-spoken, elegant woman that had an iron core. There wasn't a member of the cabinet, and this is the simple truth. I'm not changing things in retrospect or hindsight. There wasn't a member of the cabinet that I didn't like and work well with and enjoyed working with. Griffin Bell, of course, was the Attorney General. Griffin left the administration, if my memory serves, in the summer of 1979, at the same time that Joe Califano left the Health and Human Services Department. And Brock Adams, another congressman from Washington State, the president had named Secretary of Transportation at the beginning of his administration. Brock left at the same time that Califano and Griffin Bell left. There were two very able people brought into the administration when they left. For Secretary of Transportation, Neil Goldsmith from Oregon, who later became, after the administration, the governor of Oregon. He had been the mayor of Portland, Oregon, and was a brilliant young man, my age. Neil and I were. In fact, I had met Neil years before when I got out of Harvard Law and had a friend who lived in Portland. Neil was mayor of the city at the time, and he was hard-charging, smart, articulate, and when he became Secretary of Transportation, he did a first-rate job. I I enjoyed working with him immensely. Another man that the president brought in at my recommendation, Neil was one of my recommendations, and Moon Landrieu was one of my recommendations. Neil had been mayor of Portland, Oregon. Moon Landrieu, of course, had been mayor of New Orleans. Moon Landrieu was and still is a remarkable man. He is a great politician, a man who is substantive, who relishes public policy and all the issues that face housing and urban development, having been the mayor of a big city in the country. He is also a man who could sell the proverbial ice boxes to an Eskimo. He's a great speech maker, and just has a great sort of practical sense, a lot of savvy on Moon's part. I'm sure I'm leaving out some folks, but at the sub-cabinet levels, we had a lot of very able people working in the Economic Development Administration and the sub-levels of HUD. These are all people that I worked with directly in the Interagency Coordinating Council, and that were my colleagues, I mean literally day to day and week to week. I might mention, I'm afraid I'm going into too much here, but another one of the great initiatives that President Carter did, and a great concept that he had that had been sort of time tested in Atlanta, was the concept of public-private partnerships, using government money to attract and to leverage private investment, promising public monies, federal monies, for example, the urban renewal of downtowns or the economic development activities in big cities or rural areas. But having competitive grants, putting these monies out for competitive bid to proposals from all over the country, with us looking at who was leveraging the public monies the best. What we were going for was 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 10-to-1 private monies over federal. The more private monies you could bring in for urban redevelopment or transportation initiatives or whatever, the more likely you were to get an Urban Development Action Grant, UDAG, Urban Development Action Grant. The federal government had not had many competitive programs of this nature where you're actually inviting the private sector and the mayors and the governors at the state and local levels to deal with their counterparts in the private sector, businessmen and developers and others, to come together in partnerships to build things. It was one of the most successful programs that the president had, much applauded and acclaimed. In general, Bob, Ray Marshall, goodness gracious, Ray Marshall, Secretary of Labor. Ray Marshall was also an academic. I don't know where Ray was originally from, but I associate him with Texas. I think he had come immediately from a university in Texas. He was another soft-spoken man, quiet, unassuming, hardworking. Again, I hate to repeat myself, but I can say these things about these people because I worked with every one of them on problem after problem and issue after issue, and I can say as a general matter that they never let the president down. There was some talk, a lot of talk actually, to be fair, about the so-called Georgia Mafia, meaning the folks that the president had brought in, the ones we've been talking about today, Hamilton and Jody and Stu and Frank and Jack and others. Truth of the matter is every president, without exception, brings into his White House people that he knows and who've been with him and whom he trusts. So it's whether you're talking about a Texas mafia or a California mafia or whatever, that's a common practice. But the further point of the matter is that the president's cabinet, President Carter's cabinet, with the exception of Griffin Bell, didn't have a single Georgian in it. Only Griffin. Griffin was there for roughly half the term, a little bit better than half the term, and then returned to Atlanta to join King and Spalding to practice law. Griffin had been a judge on the then Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. He had been appointed by Kennedy, and had headed John Kennedy's campaign in Georgia in 1960. I think that Carter had one of the ablest, most competent, and with a couple of exceptions, most loyal cabinet members any president ever put together. And I think the cabinet served him well. It was in the summer of 1979 that the president gave his famous speech about the crisis in confidence in the United States. It has been referred to as the malaise speech, but he never used the word malaise. It didn't occur. It didn't appear in the speech. But the president was having difficulties. He was tackling tough issues, and his popularity was down. I should note for the record that the President Carter has gotten a very bad rap, which is historically inaccurate about being ineffective with the Congress. There's only one other president post Franklin Roosevelt in modern history that had any better record in getting his initiatives passed in the Congress than Carter, and that was Lyndon Johnson. So 3 Democratic presidents, FDR and in his inimitable and sort of unparalleled way, and then Lyndon Johnson more than a generation later, and then shortly thereafter Carter. Again, I'm not trusting my memory on this, but I want to say that 75 to 80% of Carter's major initiatives were passed in the Congress. That's an extraordinary record of accomplishment, of legislative achievement. Was he popular with the Congress? Well, when you're asking the Congress to do hard things, when you're asking them to render hard votes, controversial votes on hard things, when you're asking them to address problems that haven't been addressed before because they're politically difficult, you're not going to be the most popular fellow in town. And that would describe Carter to a fair degree. The Panama Canal issue is probably as good an issue as you could come up with on that score. Several of the senators who voted with him on the Panama Canal treaties were defeated in their next elections. So they were making votes that they knew to be politically controversial, unpopular, and they did it because they did it in the interest of the country and because President Carter kept pressing for them to do it. And I must add, as I've said before earlier today, Carter and his team were doing everything we could to give those senators cover back in their states, to bring in the opinion makers, the newspaper editors and publishers and the business leaders and the developers and the academicians and others from their states, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and explaining to them why the president thought these Panama Canal treaties were so important and so overdue. I might add, as an historical footnote, that every president since Eisenhower had said in their sort of in the private record, we need to do something about the Panama Canal situation. Well, why since the 1950s when Eisenhower was president, all the way up to the late 1970s when Carter got in, had it not been addressed? Simple answer, because it was politically difficult to do it. And no one wanted to spend the political capital that they all knew would be required to get it passed. Carter did, and Carter paid political prices for it. Another area in which Carter was asking people to do difficult things was energy. He's been mocked is perhaps a little bit harsh a word, but ridiculed for emphasizing the importance of putting solar panels in your homes. He put solar panels in the White House. He passed tax incentives for the encouragement of investment in solar power and wind power and geothermal power and other alternative sources of energy, and has been derided by some for doing it. I don't want to get into the big ifs of if we had had a second term, but I will say this. If we had had the benefit of a second term, the energy posture of this nation would have been radically different than it was in the years that followed. Unfortunately, for his own reasons, President Reagan literally undid many of President Carter's initiatives on these alternative sources of energy. So not only did we stand pat, we lost ground under Reagan in those areas. Also, in the late summer of '79, midsummer, late summer, Carter finally designated Hamilton as Chief of Staff. He had come to realize that he needed someone in the White House to perform that role. Not because he, the president, was any less engaged, because most assuredly he was not less engaged. But he came to believe that someone to manage the White House would help, and he designated Hamilton to take that role. When Hamilton moved into that role, there were some aspects of the role which he, for example, asked me to help him with. One was the Presidential Personnel Office. Normally, the Presidential Personnel Office, in most situations, reports to the White House Chief of Staff. The Presidential Personnel Office, in the Executive Office of the President, is the place where people are vetted, where people are considered for major appointments by the President to cabinet or sub-cabinet level, to departments and agency boards and so forth. Hamilton asked me to take that responsibility on after he became Chief of Staff, and I, for the balance of the term, in addition to my roles as Secretary to the Cabinet and Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs, I was working very closely with the Office of Presidential Personnel on all the presidential appointments. In the November of 1979 was when the hostages were taken. And that was a turning point in the Carter administration in more ways than are visible to the naked eye, I think. Obviously, it was a blow to the nation. It was a blow to the president personally. And he began in a concerted and effective way to impose sanctions on the Iranians. You know, the Iranian government had been taken over by the Ayatollah Khomeini, so it had become an Islamic state. And the Shah had left earlier in the year, and the Shah was perceived to have been supported by the the United States government. So there was a sort of natural enmity between the Islamic State that now represented Iran and the United States of America, which has remained all these years to one degree or another, to a large degree or another. You haven't asked this question, but I'm sure you would ask it, and that is, well, how did the hostage situation affect the president's efforts to be reelected? The taking of the hostages affected his reelection in a dire way. The obvious way is that the country was upset about the fact of the matter. The second fact is that he made an attempt in April of 1980, the hostages having been taken in November, to make a military rescue, and that military rescue failed because of the failure of some equipment, the helicopters. That was a blow. That was a blow to the country, and it was a blow to the president personally and politically. It resulted in the resignation of Cyrus Vance as Secretary of State. Not the firing of Secretary Vance, the resignation by Secretary Vance, and bringing in Senator Edmund Muskie as the new secretary. But there was another reason why the taking of the hostages so direly and adversely affected the president's chances for re-election. The president made a decision, which I understand the rationale of, which I disagreed with at the time, and said so respectfully, not to campaign as long as the hostages were held. Basically to devote his time and attention to the return of the hostages, which in fact he was doing. But I think the fact that he didn't get out in the hustings, that he didn't leave the White House, notwithstanding the fact that the hostages were taken, hurt him badly in the 1980 election, particularly so because he was challenged by Senator Kennedy in his own party. And that was a serious problem, because in effect the liberal wing of the party, represented by Senator Kennedy, was challenging the president for his renomination. And the president needed, in my opinion, to be out and about, to be out there in the full flush of the campaign challenging Senator Kennedy. He won the nomination, as we all know. He had 60% of the delegates, I think, going into the 80 convention. It was unfortunate, and again, as a Carter man, that Senator Kennedy did not concede and fought the president, trying to get the people who were committed on the first ballot to change the rules of the convention so that they could change their vote. And he persisted in his challenge to the president into the 80 convention. The damage that was done sort of intra-party to the Democrats by the Kennedy challenge and by everything that it represented and everything that it entailed was a serious blow to the president's chances for re-election. Mm-hmm. What other subjects would you like to talk about?
Well, there were two, I won't say campaign promises, but there were two issues in which President Carter was very interested in when he took office. One was reorganization, and the other was health care. Can you comment on that?
Yes. The president had reorganized the state government of Georgia, as we talked about earlier, and it was a reorganization that was long overdue, the government having not been reorganized since Senator Russell was governor in the early 1930s. And he knew that with respect to the federal government, there were some things that could be done to make it work more efficiently. He had two priorities, two public policy priorities in respect to reorganization. One was energy, one was education. And without going into all the details about it, he brought Jim Schlesinger in, a Republican who had been Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA and was a brilliant man. I came to know Jim rather well. Brilliant man, to be his energy advisor. And when the department was finally created under the reorganization, Jim Schlesinger became its first secretary. People have talked about, in all, particularly the Republicans, almost exclusively the Republicans, in subsequent presidential elections, about undoing the Department of Energy and the Department of Education. Governor Perry in the last presidential election, not the current one, couldn't remember exactly which three he wanted to do something about, but those were two of the three, I think. No one's ever done it. No one's ever undone them because they make perfect sense. He pulled education out of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, consolidated with that education component all the various agencies and sub-departments and groups and commissions that had something to do with education, so that there would be one sort of centralized and coordinated federal voice on education. There are legitimate questions, absolutely legitimate questions, that remain to this day about the respective roles between the federal government and the state and local governments about the management of education. And this is not the time or place to engage in those debates, but they're legitimate issues. I would, generally speaking, favor as much local control as you can have of education. I think that's where it should be primarily controlled. I think there is a federal role, if that federal role is properly managed and properly limited. But I think that the creation of the Department of Education and the Department of Energy were good initiatives on the President's part, and time has proven them to be wise.
Another of his concerns was human rights.
Yes. Before I get to human rights, I didn't answer part of your question. Healthcare. I think one of the biggest disappointments in terms of domestic policy, and one of the disappointments, one of the things that we didn't get to do, we couldn't get it passed, was hospital cost containment as a major feature of health care. Leading into 76, 77, 78, for years and years, for decades really, the health care costs had been going up at a rate much greater than inflation. And the system, I think our system still, even though President Obama has made strides in dealing with the cost containment in the system, there's still more that can be done. Well, in 77, 78, 79, President Carter was trying to get the Congress to go with some health care adjustments, and particularly hospital cost containment. And we didn't get it done. That was one of the big things that we didn't get done. There were too many powerful forces opposed to those proposals that we didn't overcome. On human rights, I would say that a centerpiece of President Carter's foreign policy was human rights. He created an Assistant Secretary of State for human rights. The whole Panama Canal Treaty was a big initiative, a huge endeavor that really sprang from his respect for human rights. I know that Reagan said we bought it, we paid for it, and we shouldn't give it away in the '80 election, and that was very damaging to the president politically. But Bob, I'll tell you, We didn't buy it. we took it, and that too is another story. But the fact that the United States government was running and owning and operating a canal in Panama, within the jurisdiction of another sovereign country, was sort of something right in the face of all of South America. And when the president started talking about human rights and then followed his speeches and his rhetoric with all these efforts to return the Panama Canal to Panama, people in Latin America, Central and South America, began to realize that Carter meant what he was saying, that it wasn't just rhetoric. And when he ultimately got the treaties passed and the transfer made, it had huge and resounding and still residual positive effects throughout Central and South America. The only true democracy in South America back then, here again, I'm not competent to say this as an historian, but it was Costa Rica, I think. Mexico certainly was a democracy, and there were others, but in general, the changes in the democratic profile of South America since the late 70s, since the Panama Canal treaties, have been really remarkable. We don't keep troops down there. We don't have armies watching our southern borders in South America, Central and South America, and it's largely because of the changes that have occurred there. I don't attribute all those changes to Carter by any stretch, but I think that he was a contributor to them. So I think his human rights policy was something that he talked the talk and he walked the walk.
Mm-hmm. I read recently where President Carter, in an interview, blamed 3 conditions for his loss in 1980: the economy, the hostages, and the split in the Democratic Party. I want to ask you this question. Do you agree that Senator Carter inherited an economic situation that was almost impossible to solve?
Again, forgive me for saying it again, but I am aware of my limits and limitations. I'm not an economist. But in my opinion, as someone who was there, watching, engaging with the president and the problems, I think that the increase in oil prices from OPEC that were reverberating throughout the entire economy. We'd have to check me on this, but as I recall, from the fall of 79, from late 79, late summer, fall 79, through 1980, the price of crude oil was going up at the rate of more than 10% a month, 120% plus in a 12-month period. I may be a little wrong on those numbers, but I'm not much off, I think. What we don't realize is that the price of crude oil doesn't just affect gasoline prices at the fuel pump for automobiles and trucks. It affects not only jet planes and the whole transportation system, the entire transportation system that moves goods throughout the country and beyond. But crude oil is a part of plastic. It's a part of what you make the interior of cars out of, and countless other things. So that alone, that impact on the economy alone, was a dire impact, running inflation and everything else up. Cost of goods up, consumer price index up. President Carter did something very politically damaging to himself when he brought Paul Volcker in as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board to deal with the inflationary problem in the country. You're right, Bob, when you say so many of those problems were caused by external forces over which the president, and for that matter, the country, didn't have much control. That's absolutely right. One of the reasons that the president had been preaching, asserting, advocating in every way that he knew how to put our country on a more energy independent basis with all these alternative fuel sources that he wanted to engender and support and incentivize, was because he didn't want us to be so dependent on foreign oil. He did not want us to be so vulnerable as a national security matter to the decisions that were being made in the Middle East about what they were going to charge us for the oil. And we were importing the vast majority of the oil that we needed. That situation has changed now because of oil shale and what we're doing in the country now. But he appointed Volcker knowing that Volcker was going to raise interest rates and going to start wringing the inflation out of the economy. He knew that was going to hurt. He knew it was going to be unpopular, and he knew it was necessary. And it was, and it did hurt, and that's one of the reasons that Reagan was elected. The country I don't know exactly when it took off, but the country started separating into right and left, particularly moving some portions of the electorate to the right. When Goldwater mounted his challenge in '64, he was raising the banners, but he was soundly defeated by Lyndon Johnson for a whole host of reasons. So you could sort of trace the shifting political loyalties in the South to Goldwater. Carter won every single southern state in the '76 election except Oklahoma and Virginia, as I recall. That's from Texas all the way over to the Atlantic coast. That's never been done before. He lost the southern states except Georgia in the '80 election. The only, as I recall, the only southern state he took in the South was Georgia. He took a total of six states, plus the District of Columbia. This bifurcation, this sort of tearing of the fabric of the country that has occurred in the last 30 years, separating us so much, paralyzing us in many ways, was not something we were dealing with in the Carter administration. Again, please understand, I am not saying there were not sharp differences of opinion. I'm not saying that there weren't liberals and conservatives and moderates on both parties, in both sides. There were. There always have been. And we've always had serious disagreements in the country from the time of Hamilton and Jefferson. We've always had our problems, and our politics sometimes have been raw and savage and nasty. But Carter had the benefit of a Republican Party, leaders of the Republican Party that would work with him on these big issues that President Obama does not have now. And I think that is a terrible detriment to the country. And as a old man that I now am, I can be fairly criticized for wishing for the good old days when even people who disagreed with each other would come together and compromise for the good of the country. Carter had the benefit of that from 1977 to 1981 largely, but he paid political prices for doing some really difficult things. And we made mistakes too. I mean, we were not faultless. There were lots of political things that we could have done, should have done, that might have changed the result. But Reagan's victory in the 1980 election was a substantial victory. He had almost 10% more of the popular vote than Carter did. Yes, John Anderson had something to do with that. John had something like 6%, just shy of 6%. And all these problems of the fracturing of the Democratic Party, the hostage crisis, the inflation, all those things contributed to Carter's defeat, no question about it. And since that time, I'm not sure that a Democratic president has enjoyed the support, the bipartisan support, albeit sometimes reluctantly given, but nevertheless the compromising support of the Congress to get things done. We're not getting things done now. We're not getting anything done that's hard now. We can't deal with our immigration problem. We can't. We're paralyzed. We can't. It's difficult for us to deal with. Our economy is improving. In fact, better than practically any economy in the world right now. Certainly better than Europe. So President Obama has done a lot of good things. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but when you want to roll something up to the Congress that requires bipartisan support, you're not going to get it, generally speaking, now, and we could get it then.
What's in the future for Jack Watson?
Well, I have 5 grandchildren, 3 girls and 2 boys, all of whom are healthy and well. Have a daughter and a son, and another daughter, my wife's daughter. And a lot of what I do now sort of focuses on them, family and grandchildren and children. I'm loving. I'm 77 years old. Just turned 77 on October the 24th. Can't believe I'm such an old fella, but I am. Knock on wood. Healthy, and as far as I know at this moment, everything's working, and I'm blessed in that way. I have spent and am spending a lot of time now reading and studying and doing things I love to do. I love motorcycles. I love motorcycles. I love horses. I love to ride both. I've in my old age, I guess, to some extent, I've become a very interested observer, a learner. I was a lawyer all my practicing life, and when you're a trial lawyer, as I was, try as you may, you don't have a lot of time to do things you like to do. And I'm now in a position to do things I like to do. I'd like to be of service. I'm certainly willing, ready, and able to be of service where I can. I just stepped down last year after 12 years on the commission at the National Portrait Gallery, and for the last 5 years, chairman of the National Portrait Gallery, one of the great institutions of the country in Washington. And I relish that service, that opportunity to help there, something that matters to me. And I suspect and hope that there may be other such things that I might contribute to. One of the reasons I admire President Carter and Rosalind, I've not mentioned Rosalind. Rosalind Carter is someone without whom Jimmy would not have been Jimmy. It's not an exaggeration to say that they have one of the best partnerships that I've ever observed in my life. I don't know how long Jimmy and Rosalind have been married, but it's a long time, more than 60 years, I'm sure. I could figure it up. But Rosalind Carter was during the White House years, and in all these years since, with the Carter Center, with her abiding interest in mental health matters and the treatment of the mentally ill, and in a range of subjects, she has been a wonderful partner to him. They both travel together. They both just been in Memphis, Tennessee, building houses together. I saw a picture in the paper just the other day, a candid shot of Rosalind and Jimmy kissing while they were building a house, which warmed my heart. But you know, as for my future, none of us knows. I've had a blessed life, and I've had opportunities to be places and to do things and to participate in a presidency that I never dreamed I would have, but for which I'm very grateful.
Jack, when President Carter decided to send Hamilton Jordan over to his re-election campaign, you became Chief of Staff.
Yes, I did. And it was a sort of seamless move. Hamilton and I had been working very closely together on a range of things, and so when the president asked Hamilton to go over and asked me to assume the Chief of Staff's job, it was something that happened, as I say, sort of seamlessly, and I retained the position through the rest of the administration, and then directed the transition on the way out. I from the Chief of Staff's position, I managed the transition to President-elect Reagan's administration, working very much with Ed Meese and with Jim Baker in that transition.
You also participated in the solution of many of the problems caused by natural disasters.
Yes, a natural outgrowth. We didn't anticipate this, but it happened quite naturally and predictably, really, because of the nature of my roles. Assistant to the President, this is before Chief of Staff. Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs, working with all the governors and state and local leaders, particularly the governors, and my role with the Cabinet, coordinating federal response and federal domestic activities and execution of domestic policy. When a natural or other disaster occurred, it fell to me to sort of coordinate it from the White House. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was not in existence until the Carter administration. We created it. And I was the contact in the White House for FEMA on behalf of the President. I recommended, with others, the creation of the Federal Emergency Management Agency because working with the natural disasters, I quickly recognized that we needed to have a centralized, sort of unitary place to deal with those disasters. Early on, the drought in the West, the very first thing that I dealt with was there had been a multi-year drought in the western states, California and the western states, which required us to put together in Washington. I'm talking now in the winter of 1977, right after we came in, a huge drought relief package that the western states needed. And I worked with Stu and others in putting together. Stu had the lead on the drafting of the legislation and the policy, but I was inputting from the governors what we needed to do. That was in the nature of a natural disaster that the governors were requiring aid and federal funding and support on. Any federal disaster, whether it was a hurricane or a tornado that required federal support, the declaration of a national disaster, a federal emergency disaster, I was involved, my staff was involved with FEMA in coordinating that. Other examples, very prominent examples of that activity were 3 Mile Island, when the nuclear reactor went down in 3 Mile Island. I was the president's representative dealing with all of the Atomic Energy Commission, and the scientists the nuclear scientists who were analyzing that, and the governor of Pennsylvania and others to deal with that natural disaster, and was operating on behalf of the president with respect to that. With respect to the trucker strike in 1978, which wasn't a natural disaster, but it was a disaster. And Mount St. Helens later, very late in the administration, probably the biggest and most complex and complicated, again, not natural disaster, but disaster that required a federal response, unlike any we'd ever had to deal with exactly, was the Mariel Harbor influx of 140,000 Cubans into South Florida from Mariel Harbor in Cuba across the Florida Straits. That required an enormous coordination and collaboration of federal assets and responses, military and otherwise, dealing with the mayors and the governors of Florida and Texas and Alabama and so forth. So that was a natural outgrowth of my role as Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs and Secretary to the Cabinet.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you.